Welcome to Books and More, the channel where powerful ideas come alive through clear, engaging storytelling. Today, we dive into Think Again by Adam Grant, a transformative book that challenges us to question our assumptions, let go of outdated beliefs, and approach life with curiosity rather than certainty. In a rapidly changing world, the ability to rethink may matter more than the ability to think fast. This book invites us to embrace humility, celebrate learning, and open our minds to new possibilities. Let's explore how rethinking can reshape our decisions, relationships, and future. Prologue. The prologue begins with the tragic story of the Man Gulch Fire in 1949, where a team of smoke jumpers was overtaken by a sudden explosive wildfire. As the flames raced toward them, their leader, Wagner Dodge, did something so unexpected that his team thought he had lost his mind. He stopped running, lit a fire in the grass around him, and laid down in the burned patch. This escape fire, a technique that had never been taught or even officially recognized, saved his life. Most of the others, clinging to their training and instincts, kept running and perished. Their deaths were not only physical, but also cognitive. They were unable to rethink their instincts, abandon their tools, or consider a radically different choice in a moment of crisis. From this story, I draw a deeper lesson. We often overvalue intelligence and undervalue the ability to rethink. In school and at work, we're taught to defend our beliefs, maintain consistent opinions, and project confidence. But in a world that changes as rapidly as ours, rigid thinking becomes a liability. I share an example from my own life. Back in college at Harvard, my friends and I created an early form of a social network, but we abandoned it quickly. We never imagined what it might become, partly due to limited skill, but mostly because we lacked the ability to rethink and recognize the potential of what we had built. Rethinking isn't only for innovators or scientists. It's a critical survival skill in every domain. The COVID-19 pandemic exemplified how outdated assumptions can mislead leaders, from underestimating the virus to misunderstanding how it spreads. At the same time, social movements have shown that societies can change course quickly when they are willing to challenge long-held beliefs. The prologue concludes with an invitation to let go of the tools and beliefs that no longer serve us and allow rethinking to become part of our identity rather than a threat to it. If we can learn to be as mentally flexible as Dodge was amidst the flames, we can live more intelligently, collaborate more effectively, and move through life with fewer regrets. Chapter 1. A preacher, a prosecutor, a politician, and a scientist walk into your mind. Chapter 1 begins with the rise and fall of Mike Lazardidis, the brilliant mind behind BlackBerry. As a boy, Mike was the kind of kid who built machines from scraps, fixed televisions for teachers, and tinkered with technology as naturally as breathing. His genius carried him into pioneering wireless email and creating one of the most iconic devices of its era. Yet what ultimately caused BlackBerry's decline was not a lack of intelligence, but a lack of rethinking. When the iPhone entered the scene, Mike saw its potential but clung to what had made BlackBerry successful: physical keyboards, email-centric design, efficient data use. His brilliance became a trap. He didn't rethink fast enough. This sets the stage for the chapter's central idea. Our minds often operate in three unhelpful modes: preacher, prosecutor, and politician, when what we need most is to think like scientists. As preachers, we protect our sacred beliefs. As prosecutors, we attack the flaws in others' arguments. As politicians, we campaign for approval. These mindsets subtly shape our reactions, often without our awareness, and keep us anchored to our existing views. I recall a conversation with Stephen Greenspan, a respected scholar on gullibility. Ironically, despite specializing in understanding why people fall for bad decisions, Stephen himself lost a significant portion of his savings to Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. His mistake wasn't foolishness. It was overconfidence in his ability to avoid being fooled. He exemplifies a truth we often overlook. Knowledge can make us more vulnerable if it breeds excessive certainty. Smart people aren't immune to bias. Sometimes they're simply better at rationalizing their own mistakes. Here, the concept of thinking like a scientist comes in, not the profession, but the mindset. Scientists treat ideas as hypotheses, not personal identity. They seek evidence that challenges their beliefs, not only evidence that supports them. They embrace uncertainty, test assumptions, and revise opinions when the data demands it. What makes scientific thinking powerful is not precision, but humility, a recognition that we can be wrong, and a delight in discovering it. I discuss how often intelligence becomes a liability. Highly intelligent people can be the most resistant to rethinking because they develop sophisticated arguments to defend their initial views. Their mental horsepower becomes a shield rather than a tool for discovery. The problem isn't thinking fast, it's thinking too rigidly. The chapter also highlights insights from behavioral research. Phil Tedlock's work shows that when we evaluate ourselves as preachers, prosecutors, or politicians, we can predict how closed or open we are to learning. Preachers fear doubt. Prosecutors fear losing arguments. Politicians fear losing approval. Scientists, meanwhile, fear only ignorance, and that fear motivates exploration. I share examples from entrepreneurial studies showing that founders who adopt a scientific mindset outperform others. Those who treat their business models as experiments rather than declarations generate more learning, pivot more effectively, and build stronger companies. The ability to rethink is not just an intellectual skill, it's a strategic advantage. The chapter ends with a sober reminder. The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge. Once we believe we have things figured out, we stop looking for new information. We cling to outdated assumptions. We mistake confidence for accuracy. Mike Lazardidis didn't fail because he lacked vision, but because his vision became stuck. And so do we, whenever we become too comfortable in our own correctness. Thinking like a scientist doesn't require wearing a lab coat. It requires being willing to doubt, revise, and rediscover. It means detaching our identity from our ideas and choosing curiosity over conviction. When we adopt that mindset, we become more adaptable, more resilient, and ultimately more capable of seeing the world as it truly is, not as we insist it should be. Chapter 2. The Armchair Quarterback and the Impostor. Finding the Sweet Spot of Confidence. Chapter 2 opens with a striking example from the world of neuroscience. Patients with Anton syndrome, a rare condition in which people become completely blind, yet continue to believe they can see. They bump into door frames, misidentify objects, and insist everything is fine, even when the evidence contradicts them. I use this image as a metaphor for a very human tendency. We're often blind to our own blind spots, unaware of what we don't know, and far too confident in our flawed conclusions. This becomes especially dangerous when paired with what psychologists call the Dunning-Kruger effect. People with the least competence often display the greatest overconfidence, precisely because they lack the skills to recognize their own limitations. They become armchair quarterbacks, certain they could coach a professional team better than the experts. Backseat drivers, sure they know the road better than the one holding the wheel. Their confidence rises not from insight, but from ignorance. To illustrate the opposite side of the spectrum, I introduce the impostor syndrome, the feeling experienced by highly capable people who fear they are frauds. Instead of overestimating their abilities, they chronically underestimate themselves. They replay small mistakes in their minds, discount compliments, and attribute success to luck. These imposters often excel precisely because they work harder to compensate for a doubt that never seems to fade. The chapter's central message lies in exploring the tension between these two extremes. Overconfidence leads us to hold tight to mistaken assumptions. Underconfidence leads us to hold back even when we're capable. What we need is a balance I call confident humility, the courage to act coupled with the openness to rethink. A vivid example comes from the story of Davíð Oddsson, Iceland's former prime minister and later head of the country's central bank. Despite lacking economic expertise, he dismissed warnings from financial analysts and continued to push risky policies. His misplaced certainty contributed to Iceland's catastrophic financial collapse. Even afterward, Oddsson remained unshaken, insisting he had been right all along. His story underscores a key lesson: confidence without humility is a recipe for disaster. In contrast, I highlight Icelandic entrepreneur Hala Tómasdóttir, whose leadership style embodied confident humility. When she was encouraged to run for president, her first instinct was to doubt herself. Yet she didn't let that doubt define her. Instead, she evaluated her strengths honestly, acknowledged her limitations, and stepped forward with clarity rather than arrogance. Her willingness to balance self-belief with self-awareness earned her widespread respect and a surprisingly strong result in the election. Throughout the chapter, I emphasize that humility does not mean self-deprecation. It means recognizing that our current knowledge is always incomplete and our beliefs are provisional. Humility is not the opposite of confidence, it is the companion that keeps confidence from curdling into hubris. I also explore the power of embracing beginner's mind, approaching challenges as if we are new to them, even when we're experienced. This mental reset helps us avoid assumptions, listen more openly, and stay receptive to new evidence. At the same time, maintaining a foundation of confidence gives us the courage to try, to risk, and to keep learning. The chapter concludes with a reminder that our relationship with confidence shapes every dimension of our lives. When we drift toward the extremes, either believing we know more than we do or believing we know less than we can, we close the door to growth. But when we inhabit the middle ground of confident humility, we create space to learn, adapt, and improve. We become better thinkers, better leaders, and better versions of ourselves. Chapter 3. The Joy of Being Wrong, Embracing the Thrill of Rethinking. Chapter 3 begins with a simple but unsettling truth. Most of us grow up dreading the moment we're proven wrong. We tie our correctness to our competence and our competence to our identity, as if being mistaken makes us somehow smaller. Yet the people who learn and innovate most effectively don't just tolerate being wrong, they relish it. They see every mistaken assumption as an opening, every contradiction as a doorway to deeper understanding. In this chapter, I invite the reader to reframe wrongness not as a threat, but as a source of energy for growth. One of the clearest examples comes from Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist whose life's work revolves around understanding human error. Kahneman does not view mistakes as stains on his intelligence. He treats them as moments of intellectual delight. When a result contradicts his theory, he lights up. Where most of us feel embarrassment or defensiveness, he feels curiosity. His joy stems from an internal compass that points not toward being right, but toward finding truth. This mindset, this eagerness to be corrected, is at the heart of scientific thinking. But most of us operate differently. We tend to fall into what I call the confident conclusion trap. Once we form an opinion, we build a fortress around it. We gather confirming evidence, dismiss contradictions, and argue harder when challenged. We blend confidence with conviction, then mistake conviction for accuracy. This makes us feel good, but it also makes us blind. And in a world that's constantly changing, stubborn certainty becomes a liability. To loosen that rigidity, the chapter contrasts two thinking modes: confirmatory thinking and exploratory thinking. Confirmatory thinking is our brain's default setting. It's quick, emotional, and committed to proving that our initial idea is correct. Exploratory thinking is slower, more deliberate, and more interested in uncovering what's actually true, even at the cost of our ego. Children operate naturally in exploratory mode. They ask why and how without embarrassment. They delight in discovering unexpected answers. But as adults, fear of looking foolish slowly replaces that curiosity. One powerful demonstration of exploratory thinking comes from the world of forecasting. Researchers studying elite super forecasters found that the best predictors of world events weren't necessarily geniuses. They were people unusually willing to update their beliefs. They saw each prediction as a hypothesis and every new piece of information as an opportunity to adjust. Their secret wasn't superior intelligence, it was superior humility. Instead of anchoring themselves to their first judgment, they flowed with evidence as it emerged. Throughout the chapter, I draw attention to the emotional barriers that keep us from embracing wrongness. Pride, insecurity, and social pressure all push us toward intellectual defensiveness. We fear that if we admit one mistake, people will assume we're wrong about everything. But the opposite is usually true. When we acknowledge uncertainty and show we're open to correction, people trust our judgment more, not less. They see us as thoughtful rather than stubborn, curious rather than combative. To move closer to the scientist's mindset, I encourage readers to detach their identity from their ideas. Instead of thinking, I am right, we can think, this is the best information I have right now. Instead of being wrong makes me look weak, we can think, being wrong helps me become stronger. When we treat our beliefs as drafts rather than monuments, we're free to revise them without self-betrayal. The chapter closes with a reminder that discovering we're wrong is not a failure, it's a feature of learning. It means we're alive to the complexity of the world, willing to course correct, and humble enough to grow. The joy of being wrong is ultimately the joy of becoming wiser. When we embrace that, rethinking stops being threatening and becomes exhilarating, a journey not away from confidence, but toward a deeper, sturdier form of it. Chapter 4. The Good Fight Club. The Psychology of Constructive Conflict. Chapter 4 opens with the surprising truth that some of the most innovative partnerships in history were built not on harmony, but on healthy disagreement. I begin with the Wright brothers, Wilbur and Orville, whose breakthrough in aviation wasn't the product of quiet collaboration, but of relentless debate. They challenged each other fiercely, critiqued every assumption, and refused to settle for easy consensus. Their arguments weren't personal attacks, they were intellectual sparring matches designed to sharpen ideas. This is the spirit of what I call constructive conflict, the kind of disagreement that fuels progress instead of shutting it down. To understand why some conflicts help us and others hurt us, I turn to organizational psychologist Karen Jen's distinction between task conflict and relationship conflict. Task conflict is about ideas, how to design a product, solve a problem, or choose a strategy. Relationship conflict is about personalities, resentment, ego, and emotional friction. The first type can make teams smarter, the second makes teams miserable. The challenge is that many people avoid any conflict for fear of triggering the emotional kind. As a result, teams settle for artificial harmony and promising ideas die quietly. One of the most illuminating lessons of the chapter is that disagreement isn't the enemy. Poorly managed disagreement is. When people feel psychologically safe, they're willing to voice dissent, ask unconventional questions, and challenge authority. But when they fear judgment or punishment, they retreat into silence. In that silence, innovation withers. This dynamic explains why some of the brightest thinkers hesitate to speak up, while the loudest voices dominate by default. Without a culture that welcomes dissent, organizations drift into groupthink. I share examples from creative partnerships like John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Tina Fey and Amy Poehler, and the animators at Pixar. What these seemingly different collaborations have in common is a foundation of respect strong enough to withstand friction. At Pixar, directors surround themselves not with cheerleaders, but with what Brad Bird calls the black sheep, the brilliant misfits unafraid to question everything. In their meetings, ideas are attacked with gusto, yet people feel valued. Conflict becomes a tool for refinement, not a weapon for destruction. The chapter also explores personalities and how each contributes to healthy debate. Agreeable people, contrary to popular belief, can be excellent debaters because they challenge others gently without triggering defensiveness. Disagreeable people, meanwhile, bring a willingness to confront issues directly. The magic happens when these tendencies coexist. The warmth of the agreeable keeps the team cohesive, while the candor of the disagreeable keeps the team honest. A group that mixes both is far less likely to fall into complacency. To help readers create their own version of a good fight club, I describe the idea of forming a challenge network, a group of trusted peers who care enough to tell you the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Most of us surround ourselves with support networks, people who offer encouragement and affirmation. Those relationships matter, but they don't make us better thinkers. Challenge networks do. They question our assumptions, push us beyond easy answers, and force us to rethink. They're not critics trying to defeat us, they're partners trying to strengthen us. Of course, constructive conflict doesn't happen automatically. It requires boundaries. Attacking ideas is productive, attacking people is destructive. Healthy debate demands curiosity, not contempt. It means listening with the intent to learn, not the intent to win. It means acknowledging when someone else's idea is better than our own. And it requires the humility to admit that we, too, might be wrong. Chapter 4 closes with a reminder that a strong team isn't defined by the absence of conflict, but by the presence of the right kind of conflict. When we embrace disagreement as an act of respect, an invitation to think harder, not fight harder, we transform friction into fuel. The good fight is not about beating others, it's about elevating the thinking of everyone in the room. And when we learn to do that, we unlock the creativity and clarity that only come from daring to challenge one another. Chapter 5: Dancing with Your Opponents: How to Win Debates and Influence People. Chapter 5 opens with a remarkable showdown between Harish Matarajan, the world's most celebrated competitive debater, and an AI system designed by IBM to argue against him. The topic was early childhood education, a subject where data overwhelmingly favored the AI's position. Yet Harish still managed to sway the audience. His secret wasn't sharper facts, it was a different kind of strategy. He didn't treat the debate as a duel, but as a dance, guiding his opponent and the audience through a thoughtful human exchange. That moment serves as a metaphor for the entire chapter. Persuasion is not about overpowering others, but about moving with them. I confess that I learned this lesson the hard way. Earlier in my career, a student once told me I was a logic bully, someone who pummeled people with facts until they had no room left to think for themselves. I believed that strong arguments should win by sheer force. What I didn't understand was that overwhelming people with logic often backfires. When people feel attacked, they cling even more tightly to their beliefs. Defensiveness replaces curiosity, and the mental door slams shut. Persuasion fails not because our arguments are weak, but because our approach is. The heart of this chapter is a shift in mindset. Stop trying to change people's minds, help them find reasons to change their own. Harish excels at this because he approaches debate with humility and curiosity. Instead of declaring supremacy, he acknowledges complexities. Instead of insisting he's right, he creates space for the audience to explore. He uses questions to invite reflection, points out nuance rather than delivering knockout punches, and builds on whatever small common ground exists. That approach turns resistance into receptivity. One of the most effective techniques in this process is motivational interviewing, a counseling method that encourages people to articulate their own reasons for change. The more someone voices a new belief, the more likely they are to adopt it. The same principle applies in arguments. Rather than saying, "You're wrong," we can ask, "What evidence would change your mind?" Or, "How did you come to that conclusion?" Questions convert confrontation into collaboration. Another powerful insight is the value of admitting uncertainty. It sounds counterintuitive, but expressing doubt, saying, "I might be wrong," or "This is just my understanding," actually increases credibility. People trust us more when we show we're not married to our views. It signals confidence without arrogance. It also gives the other person permission to rethink without feeling defeated. The moment we let go of the need to be unquestionably right, the other person can let go of the need to be unquestionably defensive. I illustrate this idea with examples from negotiations, leadership, and everyday disagreements. When I asked entrepreneurs to present not only the strengths of their business ideas, but also the weaknesses, investors rated them as more trustworthy and were more likely to fund them. When managers admitted mistakes to their teams, employees viewed them as more capable, not less. These cases reinforce a single truth: vulnerability invites openness. The chapter also explores the danger of argument dilution, the instinct to overwhelm opponents with more and more reasons. People think piling on arguments makes them stronger, but if even one of those arguments is weak, it undermines the rest. Skilled persuaders do the opposite. They lead with their strongest point and stop before the message becomes cluttered. Ultimately, Chapter 5 reframes persuasion as a cooperative act. It's not a war of words, it's a guided movement between minds. When we listen deeply, ask genuine questions, acknowledge uncertainty, and let go of the need to dominate, we create the conditions for others to rethink. Winning a debate is not about defeating someone else, it's about helping them discover a better version of their own perspective. And in the process, we often end up discovering a better version of ours too. Chapter 6: Bad Blood on the Diamond: How to Weaken Stereotypes and Reduce Prejudice. Chapter 6 begins in the world of competitive sports, where rivalries often turn into open hostility. Fans cheer for their team with passion, but that passion can quickly slip into something darker: hatred for the opposing side. What seems trivial at first glance reveals something fundamental about human psychology. We construct simple stories about us and them, and once those stories harden into stereotypes, they become incredibly difficult to dislodge. This chapter asks a central question: how do we get people to rethink narratives they've believed their entire lives? To explore this, I introduce Daryl Davis, a Black musician who spent decades doing something both dangerous and extraordinary: meeting with members of the Ku Klux Klan. Instead of confronting them with accusations or moral lectures, he sat down with them in diners, living rooms, and bar basements, just talking, listening, and asking questions. His curiosity disarmed them. The simple question he asked each member, "How can you hate me if you don't even know me?" forced them to experience cognitive dissonance. They were meeting a Black man who contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. Some of these men eventually gave up their robes because a single human relationship cracked the rigid shell of their bigotry. This method highlights a crucial principle: prejudice doesn't dissolve when people feel attacked, it dissolves when people feel understood. Many of us assume the way to fight stereotypes is to argue against them, but direct confrontation often backfires. People cling to their beliefs more tightly when they sense threat or judgment. They need to discover inconsistencies in their beliefs on their own. Daryl's approach works not because he had superior arguments, but because he created an experience that made their old story feel incomplete. The chapter then turns to research on stereotype disruption, the process of introducing incongruent information that contradicts a person's existing narrative. When someone's worldview is built on a simplistic model, "those people are all the same," even a single disconfirming example can plant the seed of doubt. The challenge is that one counterexample often gets dismissed as the exception. What we need are repeated, humanizing interactions that complicate the story until the stereotype becomes too fragile to survive. One powerful insight from psychology is that contact alone is not enough. Exposure to people from different groups works only under specific conditions: equality of status, cooperative goals, and a safe environment. Without these elements, interactions can worsen tensions instead of easing them. This explains why diverse schools and workplaces don't automatically produce harmony. Diversity creates opportunity, inclusion creates change. I also describe how stereotypes persist not just because they're taught, but because they simplify the world. Our brains love shortcuts, and stereotypes offer an easy, though inaccurate, way to navigate complexity. Overcoming them requires slowing down our thinking long enough to see individuals instead of categories. It demands curiosity, not certainty. The chapter includes stories from sports teams where players who once loathed their opponents discovered unexpected respect when they became teammates. I highlight examples from multicultural organizations where structured dialogue and shared missions helped people rethink assumptions about gender, race, and nationality. Again and again, the message is the same. The more nuance we introduce into a stereotype, the weaker it becomes. Chapter 6 concludes with a reminder that changing minds is not an act of force, but an act of gentle disturbance. You cannot shame someone out of a prejudice built over decades, but you can give them experiences that make their old beliefs wobble. You can invite them into conversations where they feel safe enough to question themselves. You can help them see complexity where they previously saw only simplicity. And once a mind starts to see nuance, it becomes much harder for hatred to hold on. Chapter 7: Vaccine Whisperers and Gentle Interrogators, Listening Our Way into Other People's Minds. Chapter 7 opens with the moving story of Marie-Hélène Etienne Rousseau, a mother whose premature son spent months in a neonatal intensive care unit. Like many parents in her circle, she feared vaccines deeply, fears shaped by stories, instincts, and a long cultural history of mistrust. Even in the face of a measles outbreak, she hesitated. What changed her mind wasn't a barrage of facts or a stern warning. It was a quiet conversation with a doctor who didn't try to win an argument but to understand her worry. This sets the tone for the entire chapter. Persuasion begins with listening, not lecturing. That doctor was Arnaud Gagneur, known as a vaccine whisperer. His weapon wasn't statistics, it was motivational interviewing, a method designed not to pressure people into agreement, but to help them explore their own motivations and doubts. Instead of telling Marie-Hélène she was wrong, Arnaud asked about her fears. Instead of preaching, he reflected her words back to her with calm curiosity. He acknowledged the confusion caused by conflicting information, and he reinforced her identity as a loving mother who wanted the best for her child. By the end of the conversation, she chose vaccination not because she was convinced, but because she felt understood. This illustrates a larger truth. When people feel judged, they dig in. When they feel heard, they open up. Many of us assume that if we just offer better arguments, more facts, more graphs, more citations, we'll change someone's mind. But research shows the opposite. When people feel attacked, they defend their beliefs more fiercely. When they feel autonomy and respect, they begin to rethink on their own. Motivational interviewing works because it reverses the traditional persuasion script. Instead of pushing our reasons, we draw out theirs. Instead of saying, "Here's why you're wrong," we ask, "How did you come to this view?" Or, "What concerns you most about changing your mind?" These questions invite people to speak openly, and in speaking, they often uncover inconsistencies they hadn't noticed. The seeds of change grow from their voice, not ours. The chapter expands this idea to other domains: addiction treatment, education, criminal rehabilitation, even everyday disagreements between friends. Across contexts, the principle holds. People don't resist change itself, they resist being changed by someone else. When we ease off the pressure, they lower their defenses. And when we offer empathy instead of argument, they begin to update their beliefs. I share examples of how even well-intentioned experts often get in their own way. Doctors overwhelm patients with medical jargon. Environmentalists bombard skeptics with catastrophic predictions. Leaders try to inspire teams by insisting on certainty. In each case, people mistake force for effectiveness. They forget that the more we push, the more others pull away. The alternative requires humility. Skilled persuaders admit what they don't know. They avoid certainty. They show vulnerability. Paradoxically, acknowledging uncertainty makes them more trustworthy. When someone says, "I could be wrong, but here's how I understand it," their audience relaxes. The conversation becomes a partnership rather than a confrontation. The chapter highlights another crucial insight. If you want someone to reconsider, let them save face. People rarely abandon a belief when doing so feels like admitting incompetence. But if we reassure them that changing their mind is a sign of growth, not weakness, they can rethink without shame. Marie-Helene did more than vaccinate her premature son. She went home and vaccinated her older children and encouraged relatives to do the same. What changed wasn't her fear of disease, but her relationship with uncertainty. She learned that rethinking is not surrender, it is responsibility. Chapter 7 closes with a powerful message. Listening is not a soft skill. It is a catalyst for change. When we shift from trying to win arguments to trying to understand the person behind the argument, we earn the one thing persuasion requires most, an open mind on the other side. And once a mind is open, new ideas finally have room to take root. Chapter 8. Heated Conversations, Cooling Down Division Through Complexity. Chapter 8 begins inside a small research lab at Columbia University, a place with a deceptively calm name, the Difficult Conversations Lab. Here, researchers place pairs of strangers, people who stand on opposite sides of polarizing issues like gun control, abortion, and immigration, into a room and ask them to talk. These conversations often have the potential to explode, but the goal of the experiment is not to witness conflict. It is to understand what makes some conversations collapse into hostility while others evolve into genuine understanding. The striking discovery is that the outcome of these tense dialogues hinges on something surprisingly simple: how the issue is framed before the conversation even begins. When participants read articles that present topics in black and white terms, two sides locked in a moral battle, their conversations quickly mimic that rigidity. But when they read articles that portray issues as multi-layered, complex, and filled with nuance, something changes. Their conversations become more open, more curious, and more empathetic. They search for common ground instead of trying to score points. A small shift in framing unlocks a big shift in behavior. From this insight emerges the chapter's central theme. The biggest barrier to productive dialogue is binary thinking. When we treat debates as two-sided, right versus wrong, good versus evil, we flatten reality and shut down exploration. Binary thinking is cognitively comfortable but socially corrosive. It pushes people toward extremes, fuels partisanship, and creates the illusion that nuance is weakness. In truth, nuance is the oxygen that keeps dialogue alive. To illustrate this, I revisit a high-profile incident in Central Park involving a black birdwatcher and a white dog owner whose panicked reaction escalated into a racially charged confrontation. The public conversation that followed quickly polarized into oversimplified narratives, either demonizing the woman as irredeemably racist or minimizing the racial dynamics entirely. But the birdwatcher himself responded with nuance. He acknowledged the racial implications without reducing her entire identity to a single moment. His approach embodied the kind of complexity that helps societies rethink deep-rooted issues instead of deepening divides. The chapter explores why nuance is so difficult to embrace. Part of the challenge lies in our emotional wiring. When we feel morally threatened, our instinct is to defend, attack, or retreat. Another part lies in social incentives. Political campaigns, media headlines, and viral content all reward bold, simplified narratives. Yet, when we simplify people, we dehumanize them. And when we simplify issues, we misunderstand them. To counter this, I offer tools for creating conversations where complexity can survive. One is perspective taking, the conscious effort to understand not just what others believe, but why. Another is perspective getting, which involves asking real questions instead of assuming answers. People think they know what the other side believes, but those assumptions are often caricatures. When we ask sincere questions, we replace guesswork with insight. Another strategy is to trade certainty for humility. Instead of stating absolutes, we can express probabilities or acknowledge uncertainty. This encourages the other person to lower their defenses. A sentence like, "I'm not entirely sure, but here's how I see it," signals openness. It invites a conversation rather than a confrontation. The chapter emphasizes that emotion is not the enemy of logic. Emotion is the entry point to it. If people feel dismissed or attacked, they won't hear our reasoning, no matter how sound it is. But if they feel respected, they become capable of engaging with ideas that challenge them.
Chapter 8 ends with a hopeful message. Heated conversations don't have to burn bridges. When we add nuance, encourage curiosity, and approach disagreements like scientists rather than warriors, we cool the temperature. We stop treating debate as a battlefield and start treating it as a shared investigation. We learn that understanding doesn't require agreement, and that complexity, far from being a burden, is what brings us closer to the truth and closer to one another.
Chapter 9. Rethinking Textbooks, Teaching Kids to Question Instead of Memorize. Chapter 9 opens in a middle school science classroom in Quincy, Massachusetts, where students appear to excel on tests, yet struggle to explain even basic concepts when asked to reason aloud. They can recite definitions and repeat formulas, but once a teacher pushes them with a simple "why" or "how do you know," their confidence evaporates. This scene captures a flaw at the heart of modern education. We reward students for what they can repeat, not for how they think. We have built systems optimized for memorization, not understanding. Systems that produce correct answers, but not curious minds. The chapter challenges the assumption that learning is about accumulating information. True learning, I argue, begins with confronting the limits of our knowledge. It starts with questions, not answers. Yet most classrooms inadvertently penalize questioning. Teachers feel pressure to move quickly through curricula. Students feel pressure to avoid mistakes. As a result, the natural curiosity children possess, the instinct to poke, prod, and rethink, fades as they grow older. I introduce Annie Murphy Paul, a writer who has studied how people learn most effectively. Her research shows that durable understanding emerges when learners are invited to think like scientists, to form hypotheses, test them, revise them, and reflect on the process. When students predict outcomes before seeing results, they become active participants in their own learning. The friction between expectation and reality, between what they believe and what they discover, creates a powerful engine for growth. I highlight experiments in which students are asked to make guesses before watching a physics demonstration. Even when their guesses are wrong, or especially when they're wrong, their comprehension deepens. Mistakes become springboards instead of setbacks. This stands in stark contrast to traditional classrooms where error is stigmatized. But in environments where error is normalized, students learn to detach their identity from their answers. They become less defensive, more curious, and more willing to rethink. The chapter also examines the story of Derek Black, who grew up immersed in white supremacist ideology. Despite being intelligent and well-educated, Derek never questioned the worldview that was handed to him. It wasn't schooling that changed him, it was conversation. A group of college students invited him to dinner week after week, not to attack him, but to understand him. In that space of respectful curiosity, Derek confronted contradictions in his beliefs and ultimately rejected the ideology he once preached. His journey illustrates that education is not just what we learn in classrooms, it's the process of discovering that we were wrong. This leads to a discussion of identity foreclosure, the pressure young people feel to commit early to a career or purpose. Adults ask children what they want to be, as if identity must be fixed at age 10. Students choose majors before they've explored alternatives. Many become trapped in choices they made before they knew themselves well enough to decide. The chapter argues that education should help students expand their identity, not narrow it. Instead of preparing them for a single future, we should prepare them to navigate many possible futures. I emphasize the role of teachers who create what I call thinking classrooms, places where students feel safe to challenge ideas, including the teachers. These teachers frame lessons around inquiry, encourage debate, and celebrate intellectual humility. They ask questions that don't have predetermined answers, pushing students to reason, justify, and reconsider. Their classrooms become laboratories of the mind, where rethinking is not an exception, but a habit. Chapter 9 closes with a message that extends far beyond schools. In a world defined by rapid change, the most valuable skill is not knowing more. It is the ability to rethink what we know. When we teach children to question, explore, and revise, we prepare them not just for exams, but for life.
The goal of education should not be to close minds around a set of answers, but to open them to the lifelong practice of learning, unlearning, and learning again.
Chapter 10, That's Not How We've Always Done It, Building a Culture of Learning at Work. Chapter 10 opens with a familiar workplace refrain. This is how we've always done it. It's a sentence that appears harmless, even practical, yet it is often the quiet enemy of progress. In this chapter, I explore why organizations cling to outdated routines, why success can make companies complacent, and how leaders can create environments where learning, not inertia, becomes the default. One of the most sobering examples comes from NASA, a place defined by innovation and exploration. Yet even NASA fell victim to the trap of routine. Before the Challenger and Columbia disasters, engineers raised multiple warnings about loose foam and failing O-rings. But because similar anomalies had occurred before without catastrophe, leaders convinced themselves the risks were acceptable. This phenomenon, the normalization of deviance, shows how repeated success can disguise growing danger. When nothing bad happens, we assume nothing bad will happen. From this starting point, the chapter contrasts two types of work cultures: performance cultures and learning cultures. Performance cultures emphasize flawless execution, meeting targets, and avoiding mistakes. People become afraid to speak up, afraid to experiment, and afraid to look incompetent. Learning cultures, by contrast, focus on curiosity, reflection, and continuous improvement. They don't treat mistakes as embarrassments, but as data. They reward people not for being perfect, but for being willing to rethink. The key ingredient that separates the two is psychological safety, a term Amy Edmondson coined to describe environments where people feel safe taking interpersonal risks. Edmondson's research revealed a counterintuitive finding. The most effective medical teams reported more mistakes, not fewer. They weren't making more errors, they were simply more honest about them. Being open about error allowed them to correct problems early, learn from one another, and avoid repeating failures. Transparency became a strategic advantage. I introduce leaders who embody this mindset. One is Ellen Ochoa, astronaut and head of the Johnson Space Center, who championed a culture of questioning. She carried a set of challenge prompts, questions like, "What assumptions are we making?" or "What evidence would change your mind?" and encouraged her team to use them. Her approach transformed meetings from presentations into investigations. The emphasis shifted from defending ideas to refining them. The chapter also examines the dangers of worshiping best practices. When organizations believe they found the best way to do something, they stop searching for better ways. Best practices become frozen practices. Instead of adapting to new information, teams cling to outdated methods that once worked but no longer fit the environment. I argue that we should replace best practices with better practices, signaling a commitment to continual evolution. Examples from other industries reinforce this idea. At Amazon, leaders embrace the principle of disagree and commit, allowing teams to move forward with experimentation even when opinions diverge. At a major hospital, surgeons review their own operations with the same rigor athletes use to analyze game footage. These practices create a culture where learning is not an afterthought, it's the engine of excellence. Throughout the chapter, I emphasize that building a learning culture starts with leaders who model intellectual humility. When managers admit their own blind spots, employees feel permission to examine theirs. When leaders say, "I might be wrong," others feel safe to voice concerns. Humility at the top cascades downward. The chapter concludes with a reminder that organizations don't fail because they chose the wrong strategy once. They fail because they cling to the wrong strategy too long. Progress depends on creating workplaces where people continually question assumptions, update beliefs, and refine processes. A culture of learning isn't built on knowing all the answers. It's built on the courage to say, "Let's rethink this." Chapter 11, Escaping Tunnel Vision, Rethinking Our Career and Life Plans. Chapter 11 opens with a vivid metaphor. Many of us move through life as if we're walking inside a tunnel, seeing only the narrow path in front of us, while everything outside our chosen route fades into darkness. We cling to early decisions, majors we picked at 18, career paths we chose at 22, goals we set before knowing who we were. And once we've invested years of effort, changing direction can feel like betrayal. This chapter explores how tunnel vision traps us and how rethinking can free us to pursue careers and lives that actually match who we've become. I begin with a reflection from my own childhood. I always dreaded the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? Not because I lacked ambition, but because I sensed the question was flawed. It demanded certainty from a mind still taking shape. Yet society rewards those who appear unwavering. Students who declare their plans early are admired. Students who explore are treated as lost. That pressure to choose early sets the stage for a lifetime of overcommitment to outdated goals. Then I turned to my cousin Ryan, a model of early certainty. Even as a preschooler, he insisted he would become a doctor. His parents believed in him, teachers nurtured him, and cultural expectations reinforced the path. Ryan followed it all the way into medical school. But in a rare moment of vulnerability, he confessed that he once considered economics. He dismissed the thought immediately, not because it lacked appeal, but because he feared stepping off the pre-written script. His identity had fused with his goal. To rethink would have meant to unravel. This is the danger of identity foreclosure, committing to an identity before exploring alternatives. When we do this, our goals stop reflecting who we are and start dictating who we must be. We begin to protect the plan instead of questioning it. And because we want to avoid regret, we double down on choices that no longer fit us. The chapter then delves into the psychology of escalation of commitment, the tendency to stick with failing paths simply because we've already invested so much in them. Careers operate the same way as bad investments. The more we pour in, the harder it is to walk away, even when staying drains our potential. I share stories of students who pursued prestigious jobs they secretly disliked, convinced that quitting would make their past effort meaningless. In reality, quitting was the only way to recover meaning. One of the most powerful tools for escaping this trap is what I call a career checkup, a scheduled moment every 6 months to ask whether your growth, values, and interests still align with your path. Just as we visit doctors to detect problems before they worsen, career checkups help us catch misalignment before we waste years chasing a goal that no longer fits. I tell the story of Marissa, a former student who excelled at a top consulting firm. Promotions came quickly, praise was plentiful, and her resume sparkled. But through regular check-ins with her partner, she realized she was no longer learning. She'd hit what I call a learning plateau. The job was feeding her status, but starving her curiosity. With the courage to rethink her trajectory, she left the fast track and pursued doctoral research, a dramatic shift that gave her back her sense of growth. The chapter emphasizes that rethinking our life plans is not an admission of failure. It is a recognition that we evolve. The person who chose your path years ago is not identical to the person you are now. Updating your goals doesn't mean your past was wrong. It means your future is ready for an upgrade. Chapter 11 ends with a liberating message. You owe more to your future self than to your past self. Life is not a tunnel, but a landscape with countless trails. You are allowed to turn, to explore, to backtrack, to choose again. The most meaningful lives are not built by sticking stubbornly to old maps, but by having the courage to draw new ones as you grow.